It is late autumn in Vienna, 1948. The night air presses heavily upon the palace, as though the weight of history itself has gathered to witness the slow extinguishing of a man who once held the fate of nations in his hands. I, the royal physician, write these words not only as a record of my duty, but as a confession of what I have seen, what I have heard, and what I have come to know about the life of Ferdinand I of Bulgaria. Even now, as he lies upon the grand bed draped in dark velvet, his body weakened and trembling, there is an aura of command about him. The years have stolen his strength, yes, but not his gaze. His eyes, sharp as glass, flicker with defiance even as death closes in. To tend to him in these final days is to tend to a man at war with his own past, a past riddled with glory, scandal, betrayal, and secrets whispered only in the deepest shadows of Europe's palaces. I have served monarchs before. I have seen kings brought low by illness, emperors shaken by loss. Yet none have left so profound a mark upon me as Ferdinand. For in him lies a paradox, a sovereign who ruled with iron will, yet lived his private life cloaked in constant fear, a father who gave his dynasty an heir, yet cursed that very heir as a traitor, a man who demanded devotion from his people, yet could never give himself fully to any one person, not even to love. The corridors of this Austrian residence echo with silence. His family is not here, only a few attendants, their loyalty bound more by habit than affection. Bulgaria, the nation he once shaped with ambition and cruelty alike, does not mourn him. No embassy sends envoys to his bedside. No church bell tolls for his passing. He dies as he has lived in his latter years, exiled, forsaken, remembered only in whispers. But to understand this lonely end, one must travel back across decades, to a Europe of shifting alliances and crumbling empires. The story of Ferdinand is not merely the story of a king, but the story of a man torn between two irreconcilable selves, the public mask of authority and the private longing for freedom. It is the story of a man who sought to master history, only to be consumed by it. I recall the first time I touched his wrist, measuring the faltering rhythm of his pulse. His skin, though fragile, seemed to carry the weight of centuries, as if the blood of the Habsburgs, the Coburgs, and the dynasties of old still pulsed with stubborn pride. His fingers twitched, as though grasping for a crown that had long since slipped from them. And in a hoarse whisper, he asked me, half in jest, half in desperation, if death would come to him as a loyal servant or as a traitor. That is Ferdinand. Even on the brink of death, he sees the world as a court of intrigue, where loyalty is suspect and betrayal inevitable. Perhaps that is why he never truly trusted anyone. Perhaps that is why his reign, though long and transformative, is remembered as much for its shadows as for its light. What is a king, if not the sum of his choices? And what is a man, if not the sum of his secrets? Ferdinand was both. A king who turned Bulgaria from a fragile principality into a kingdom recognized by Europe, and a man whose hidden desires threatened constantly to undo him. As I sit at his bedside, pen in hand, I wonder, will history remember him as the brilliant strategist who modernized Bulgaria, or as the tyrant whose arrogance led it to ruin? Will his name be spoken with reverence, or will it fade into silence, buried beneath the scandals he tried so desperately to conceal? This is not a tale of simple victories and defeats. This is the tale of Ferdinand I, a man of masks, a king of contradictions, a soul forever at war with itself. And I, his physician, the last witness to his decline, will tell it as it unfolded, not as the official records would have it, not as the chroniclers of kings would dare write it, but as I saw it, in blood and in whispers. For now, the candle beside his bed burns low. The shadows lengthen across his face, sculpting the sharp angles of a ruler who once terrified ministers and generals alike. Yet in the stillness, I see not a monarch, but a frail man who fears being forgotten. His lips part, and I hear him murmur a name not of family, nor of nation, but of a lover long lost to secrecy. I will not write that name here. Not yet. It belongs to a later chapter when masks begin to slip. But let this serve as the beginning. Let us step into the world of Ferdinand I, where crowns are heavy, love is forbidden, and the cost of ambition is nothing less than the soul itself. And so the story begins. When destiny carried me from the darkened corridors of Vienna into the sunlit courts of Naples, I did not arrive as a conquering prince. I arrived as a pawn, moved across the chessboard of Europe by the invisible hands of diplomats and dynasties. My marriage to Maria Carolina of Austria was no accident, no gentle union of affection. It was strategy woven in silk. She was the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, sister to Marie Antoinette, and through her, Austria extended its grip into southern Italy. To the court, I was a king. To the Habsburgs, I was an instrument. Maria Carolina was unlike the Neapolitan court I inherited. Where my father had thrived in simplicity, she thrived in calculation. She had been educated, shaped in the crucible of Vienna's political theater, and she carried herself with a certainty that both fascinated and unsettled me. To her, Naples was not a sunlit jewel by the sea, but a fortress to be governed, controlled, and bent toward Austrian designs. It was she, not I, who first tasted true power in our marriage bed. For every whisper I made to ministers, her voice echoed louder in council. It was said she was my partner, but soon the people saw her as the hand on the throne. She learned the language of Naples faster than I ever mastered the art of ruling. Her alliances extended beyond family ties. She drew Britain closer, balancing against the shadow of France. She corresponded tirelessly, weaving a web of influence that left me, the king, curiously peripheral. I, Ferdinand, should have been the fulcrum of the realm. Yet in council chambers, I often felt like a guest. Still, Naples thrived, or seemed to. The city was alive with theater, music, and spectacle. Festivals stretched late into the night, masking the silent hunger of the poor. The Bourbon crown glittered, but its luster was fragile. While Maria Carolina concerned herself with diplomacy and treaties, I sought solace in hunting, in laughter, in the raw pleasures of the countryside. They called me Il Re Lazzarone, the king who mingled with fishermen and peasants, who walked among the people in torn clothes and with grease on his fingers. They laughed, yes, but there was affection too. To them, I was one of their own. But affection does not steady a throne. Europe was shifting, trembling beneath the weight of revolution. Whispers from Paris carried news of guillotines, of kings brought low not by rival monarchs, but by their own people. Maria Carolina trembled at those tales. Her sister's name, Marie Antoinette, was on the lips of mobs. And in her fear, she grasped at power ever more tightly. She leaned upon British fleets, on Austrian arms, and she pulled me with her, deeper into the coils of alliances I barely controlled. I confess, in those years, I felt both king and captive. King, because Naples still bent knee to me. Captive, because I knew the true strings of power were not mine to pull. Maria Carolina's intelligence dazzled the courts of Europe, but it cast me into shadow. I wore the crown, but the crown was heavy with her voice. Yet even in her dominance, I was not blind. I saw the tides swelling beneath us, the poverty of Naples, the restless murmur of reform, the dangerous allure of liberty spoken in taverns and pamphlets. I felt a storm approaching, though I could not name it. Looking back, I wonder, was it fate that I married a queen more formidable than myself? Or was it the curse of kingship, that the throne, for all its gold, is never truly one's own? The streets of Naples sang with joy, but in the echo of their songs I heard something else, the low rumble of an earthquake that had yet to break the surface. The world changed when Paris erupted. At first, the stories seemed like distant thunder, peasants storming a fortress, deputies shouting in the assembly, words like liberty and equality, whispered as though they were sacred prayers. But soon, the thunder rolled closer, and every monarch in Europe felt it strike the foundations of their thrones. Maria Carolina felt it most. Her sister, Marie Antoinette, was not merely a queen, she was blood. We read the reports with disbelief. First humiliation, then imprisonment, and at last, the blade of the guillotine. My wife's tears were real, her grief profound, but beneath that grief burned something colder. Hatred. France, in her eyes, was no longer a neighbor, but a beast that had devoured her kin. Her hatred became my command. Naples joined the coalitions against the revolution, our ships sailing alongside Britain's, our troops sent north under Austrian banners. But war was never distant. It crept into our own streets. Ideas travel faster than armies, and soon the cafes of Naples buzzed with dangerous talk. Students debated Rousseau, artisans demanded rights, and even the Lazzaroni, the rough, loyal poor who adored me, wondered what it meant that kings could fall. The throne beneath me no longer felt solid. Every festival I arranged seemed a distraction against despair. Bread was scarce, taxes heavy, and whispers of reform turned to shouts. When French armies marched into Italy, they did not need to conquer Naples by sword alone. They conquered with ideas. And then, the wave broke. In 1799, the Parthenopean Republic was proclaimed in Naples, forged by Neapolitan intellectuals and guarded by French bayonets. I, King Ferdinand, son of Charles, heir to Bourbon blood, was forced to flee. I remember that night with clarity, the hurried packing, the desperate shuffling through secret corridors, the bitter stench of smoke rising from streets where once I had laughed with fishermen. We escaped by sea, sheltered by the guns of the British Navy. Admiral Horatio Nelson himself was our protector, a man of steel whose reputation carried the weight of oceans. Maria Carolina trusted him. I admired him, though perhaps I also feared the coldness in his eyes. For it was Nelson who made clear that Naples's fate was now bound not only to Austria, but to Britain. I was king still, but a king preserved by foreign hands. Exile was humiliation. We watched from Palermo as the tricolor fluttered over my capital. Naples, my Naples, sang new anthems, paraded under new banners. They renamed streets, rewrote laws, spoke of liberty as though it were a gift France alone could bestow. The Neapolitan nobles, once loyal, bent their knees to the Republic. Only the Lazzaroni resisted, clinging fiercely to their king even in his absence, fighting in alleys with knives and stones against the revolutionaries. Their loyalty was touching, but it was not enough. Maria Carolina, however, refused despair. She plotted, wrote letters, wove alliances with tireless fury. Her willpower was iron, and through her determination, the counterstroke came. With Nelson's fleet and Bourbon allies, the Republic fell. The streets of Naples ran with blood as retribution swept the city. The executions were merciless. Those who had raised the banner of liberty were hanged or shot, their cries echoing through alleys I once knew as playgrounds. I returned a king, but not a savior. Naples was not restored. It was broken, scarred, and divided. The revolution had left its mark, a reminder that ideas cannot be killed by bayonets. Even as I sat once more on my throne, I sensed that the ground beneath me had changed forever. And so I asked myself, had I fled to save my crown, or had I merely delayed its inevitable fall? Napoleon rose like a storm no wall could withstand. At first, he was a name whispered in dispatches, a Corsican general who moved armies as though they were pieces on a chessboard only he could see. But soon, he was more than a general. He was destiny itself, reshaping Europe with the force of will and fire. Italy, poor fractured Italy, became his proving ground. City after city bent beneath his step, and kings who had sat proudly on their thrones found themselves outwitted, outmaneuvered, outshone. Naples was no exception. Though we had survived the Parthenopean disaster, though we had returned triumphant under Nelson's sails, we were now caught in the path of an empire that did not recognize old rights or Bourbon crowns. In 1806, Napoleon sent his brother Joseph to take Naples. There was no siege worth the name, no heroic resistance that bards would later sing of. Our armies melted away before his. Many nobles defected, eager to curry favor with the new order. Even my Lazzaroni, who once fought for me in the gutters, could not stand against the sheer weight of French artillery and modern discipline. Naples, my jewel, fell without glory.
And once again, I fled. The humiliation cut deeper than before. I crossed the sea like a shadow, retreating to Sicily under the wing of British guns. This time, it was not merely exile, it was dependence. Admiral Nelson had fallen years before, but Britain remained our shield, and in their protection, I saw both salvation and chains. A king who rules by the grace of another's navy is no king at all.
Joseph Bonaparte strutted through my palaces, wearing the crown of Naples as if it had been his all along. Later, when Napoleon elevated him to Spain, the throne passed to Joachim Murat, the dashing marshal with hair like a banner and courage fit for songs. Murat was no ordinary usurper. He was beloved. He rode among the people, dazzling them with promises of reform, drawing their loyalty as I never could. My own subjects, my own Neapolitans, cheered for another man while their true king lingered across the strait, guarded by foreign sailors. In Palermo, I paced like a ghost. Maria Carolina plodded still, sending letters, weaving webs of diplomacy, but her strength waned as the years dragged on. She aged with grief and fury, haunted by her sister's fate, by our endless exile, by the shame of seeing Napoleon's star rise ever higher. When she passed in 1814, I felt the world grow dimmer. Her fire had been fierce enough to keep me upright. Without it, I sagged into weariness. Yet history is never still. Napoleon's victories could not last forever. The Russian snows, the Spanish guerrillas, the endless coalitions, step by step, the empire cracked. And when at last the tide turned, when the great conqueror was sent into exile, Europe began to shuffle the pieces of its shattered board. In those moments, hope returned. Could the Bourbons rise again? Could Naples, after all the betrayals and blood, be restored? I dreamed of setting foot once more on the soil of my kingdom, of hearing the bells of Naples ring for their rightful king. But deep within me, I knew the Naples I had lost no longer existed. Too much had changed. Too many had tasted new ideas, new loyalties. Still, I clung to the hope. What is a king without hope? Nothing but a figure in exile waiting for history to close its book. The fall of Napoleon was not a single crash, but a series of echoes. First, a stumble in Spain, where guerrilla fighters bled his armies day by day. Then, a collapse in the frozen wastes of Russia, where even his genius could not outmaneuver winter itself. Finally, the walls of Europe closed in. Prussia, Austria, Britain, Russia, all rallying to strike him down. The man who had once seemed invincible now found himself exiled to a lonely rock in the Mediterranean. For Naples, this should have been a moment of triumph, yet it was tangled with bitter irony. Joachim Murat, my glittering rival, my replacement, had ridden Napoleon's star for years. But when that star began to fade, Murat did not fall with him. He turned. He pledged his loyalty to the Allies, to Austria most of all, desperate to preserve the throne he had stolen. His betrayal of Napoleon shocked many, but it was a shrewd betrayal, the act of a survivor. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 became the stage on which Europe decided the fate of nations. Kings, princes, and diplomats gathered to redraw borders and restore old houses to their thrones. For me, it was the long-awaited reckoning. I, Ferdinand, dispossessed, twice exiled, had a claim supported not by armies of my own, but by the principle of legitimacy. The idea that dynasties unjustly ousted by revolution should be restored. Metternich, Castlereagh, Talleyrand, these men of balance and intrigue weighed Naples in their calculations. Murat, meanwhile, played his last card. In a desperate gamble, he tried to rekindle Napoleon's dream during the 100 Days. He marched north, issuing proclamations to rally Italians under his banner, to awaken a spirit of unity that would precede the Risorgimento. But the people were not ready, and the powers arrayed against him were too strong. At Tolentino, his army was broken. He fled, betrayed and abandoned, until at last he was captured and executed by firing squad. His elegance, his flamboyance, all ended in the dust. Thus, by the judgment of Vienna and the fall of Murat, my throne was restored. In 1815, I returned to Naples not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. Bells rang in the city, streets filled with processions, and once again I sat beneath the crown that had slipped from my brow too many times. Yet the joy was hollow. I was no longer young, no longer the uncertain monarch who once hid behind Maria Carolina's fierce will. But neither was I a reformed king reborn from hardship. I had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. The people I ruled were changed. Ideas of liberty, equality, and reform had swept through Europe like wildfire, and Naples had not been spared. Murat, for all his faults, had granted constitutions, modernized codes, and opened windows to the future. I, restored, did not come to build upon them. I came to erase them, to drag my kingdom back to the old order. To me, the whispers of revolution were poison, and I sought to smother them with prisons, spies, and censorship. Still, the throne was mine again, and I sat upon it with the weight of both triumph and futility. Europe had been remade, but Naples remained a fragile jewel, torn between past and future, between Bourbon tradition and the restless tide of change. I had returned, yes, but in returning, I was already a relic. The restored Bourbon throne sat heavily upon me. After so many years of exile, I clung to power with a hand that trembled between fear and stubbornness. The Europe around me had changed forever. The Congress of Vienna may have sought to restore the old order, but beneath the polished marble of its treaties, embers of rebellion still glowed. For Naples, those embers were about to become flames. Naples was restless. The people had tasted reform under Murat, modern laws, the hint of constitutional government, a glimpse of freedom. To rip that away and return them to the suffocating embrace of absolute monarchy was to demand that they forget what they had already seen. And people do not forget. Farmers in Calabria, merchants in Naples, officers who had once marched proudly under Murat's banner, all whispered of a future that did not belong to the Bourbons. In the shadows of taverns, forests, and hidden chapels, the Carbonari gathered. They were a secret society, bound by ritual and oath, speaking of liberty and brotherhood. Their name, the charcoal burners, was drawn from the labor of fire, but also from the metaphor of transformation, from wood to flame, from oppression to freedom. Though small in number, their influence spread like smoke, curling through villages and barracks, impossible to contain. I, Ferdinand, was blind, or perhaps I pretended to be. My court seethed with suspicion, my ministers urged vigilance, but I trusted in repression. I thought that spies and prisons could stifle what was, in truth, an idea too large to be shackled. The Carbonari were not alone. They were part of a wider network of discontent stretching from Spain to the German states. Across Europe, men dreamed of a new order, and Naples, backward and burdened by feudal chains, seemed ripe for it. The year 1820 brought the spark. News came from Spain. The army there had risen, forcing the king to accept a liberal constitution. The echo was immediate in Naples. In July, officers of my own army mutinied at Nola, demanding that I swear to uphold a constitution modeled on Spain's. Their cry was not for me, but for liberty, for a charter that would bind the monarchy, not exalt it. For days, Naples trembled. Crowds filled the streets, chanting for freedom. Priests, students, and soldiers marched side by side beneath banners of tricolor. My palace, usually a fortress of stone and ceremony, felt fragile as glass. At last, faced with overwhelming pressure, I relented. In the chapel of San Francesco di Paola, before the eyes of my people, I swore an oath to the new constitution. My hand rested upon the gospel, but my heart rebelled against the words. The people rejoiced, believing that at last the Bourbons had bowed to modernity. Bells rang, guns fired in salute, and Naples sang as if a new dawn had risen. But in truth, I was playing for time. I, Ferdinand, had no intention of honoring the oath. To me, the Constitution was not salvation, but humiliation. A mask I wore only until I could tear it away. Yet for a moment it seemed as if history might turn. Naples, so long caught in the grip of feudal backwardness, tasted constitutional rule. The parliament met, debates rang through chambers, laws were drafted with the ink of liberty. The Carbonari walked openly, their faces alight with triumph. For once, the Bourbon throne stood not above the people, but beside them. But the dream was fragile, and Europe was watching. In Vienna, Metternich, ever the enemy of revolution, saw in Naples a dangerous infection that must be cut out before it spread. He moved to summon the Holy Alliance, calling Austria to arms to crush what had begun in Spain and echoed in Italy. My crown, though it had bent before the storm, would soon be shielded by Austrian steel. The oath I swore in Naples was never more than a performance. My lips had spoken the words, but my mind had already chosen betrayal. To me, the Constitution was not a covenant, but a weapon forced into my hand. And so, while my people celebrated what they believed was a victory of liberty, I plotted in silence, waiting for the moment to unmake it. In Vienna, Prince Metternich received me with the knowing smile of a man who saw through every mask. I traveled there as the humbled king who had bowed to a constitution, but I carried in my heart the promise that Austria would deliver me from it. The Congress halls glittered with chandeliers, but behind their light lay cold calculation. I begged for aid, and aid was granted. Austria would march its disciplined legions south, and the Bourbon throne would be cleansed of its liberal stain. Meanwhile, in Naples, the parliament dared to believe in itself. They passed reforms, debated the powers of the monarchy, and even discussed dismantling the feudal privileges that still strangled the countryside. The Carbonari rejoiced, but their joy was built upon sand. The people, though eager for change, were fractured. Peasants longed for land reform, merchants for stability, officers for recognition, priests for influence. The Constitution promised much, but it united only for a moment. The Austrian army crossed into Italy in the winter of 1821. Snow fell on Lombardy as their banners advanced, and soon they poured down into the kingdom like an unstoppable tide. Naples could muster soldiers, but not loyalty. The officers were divided, the peasants reluctant, the treasury weak. Against Austria's iron discipline, the Neapolitan forces crumbled almost before the first shots were fired. I, Ferdinand, remained far from the battlefield. It was not I who fought, but others who bled. The defenders of the Constitution made their stand at Rieti, a desperate attempt to halt the Austrian advance. But discipline faltered, morale shattered, and the army dissolved. Naples lay open. The dream of 1820 died upon that field, trampled beneath Austrian boots. When I returned to Naples, it was as a conqueror, not of foreign lands, but of my own people. The Constitution was abolished, the Parliament dismissed, the leaders of the movement hunted down. In dark prisons, men who had once believed in freedom languished, tortured by damp stone and silence. Priests who had blessed the revolution were silenced. Officers who had sworn to defend it were stripped of rank, and the Carbonari were driven back into the shadows. I rewarded Austria with gratitude and submission, but I rewarded my people with vengeance. To me, their cries for liberty were treason, their banners blasphemy, their oaths of loyalty worthless. Naples, which had dared to dream of a new order, was thrust back into the old. Censorship, secret police, inquisitorial courts. The air itself seemed to thicken with suspicion. A careless word in a tavern, a pamphlet left on a bench, a whispered toast to freedom, all could end in exile or the gallows. And yet, repression is a double-edged sword. The Constitution of 1820 lasted less than a year, but its memory lingered. Every arrest, every hanging, every exile etched that memory deeper into the soul of the nation. Though I sought to bury it, I instead preserved it, making martyrs of those who resisted me. Naples returned to order, yes, but it was an order trembling with resentment. As I looked out over the Bay of Naples, where the waters shimmered blue beneath the sun, I convinced myself that I had restored the kingdom to stability. But in truth, I had merely delayed its reckoning. Ideas cannot be killed with prisons. Constitutions, once sworn, cannot be unsworn in the minds of those who witnessed them. My betrayal saved my throne, but it also doomed my legacy. The years after 1821 were quiet on the surface, but beneath that silence lay unease. I had my throne back, restored by Austrian steel, and I ruled as though the Constitution had been a dream, nothing more. The palace bustled with ceremony, the church rang its bells, and the markets filled with goods. To the eye, Naples seemed unchanged, as though the revolution had never passed through its streets. But I knew better. I could feel it in the way people lowered their voices in conversation, in the sudden hush that fell when soldiers entered a tavern, in the glances exchanged between strangers who feared that even the walls might be listening. I had silenced freedom, but in silencing it, I had turned every whisper into an act of defiance. Metternich called me a loyal ally, and perhaps I was. Austria had secured my throne, and in return I let their influence seep into my kingdom. Austrian envoys hovered over my court, and my policies bent in their direction. Naples was still mine, yet I was no longer truly sovereign. My people knew it. They muttered that I had traded their liberty not only for my own power, but for foreign chains. Still, I clung to life and throne alike. I was no longer young. The years had lined my face, stiffened my joints, and dulled the fire that once burned in my voice. Yet the memory of that oath in 1820 haunted me. I had broken it, yes, but I had not erased it. In moments of solitude, I would recall the roar of the crowd in the piazza, the sea of faces lifted in hope, the joy of a people who believed their future had arrived. That joy had turned to dust, and I was the hand that crushed it. By 1825, illness gnawed at me. I felt the shadow of death drawing close, and with it came reflection I could not silence. My reign had begun with turmoil, survived revolution, and ended in repression. But what would endure after I was gone? My family? My crown? Or the memory of a king who betrayed his own oath? When death finally came, it was not dramatic. I passed quietly, leaving behind a kingdom outwardly at peace but inwardly restless. The prisons were still full, the exiles still scattered, the Austrian presence still heavy. My son Francis inherited the throne, but he also inherited the burden of my choices. History has a way of stripping away the masks kings wear. I imagined myself a savior of order, but others would remember me as the man who knelt to liberty with one hand raised, then struck it down with the other. The Constitution of 1820 was short-lived, but it became a ghost that haunted my dynasty. And though I tried to smother the spirit of revolution, it returned again and again, until at last, long after my bones had turned to dust, Italy rose as one, and the dream I betrayed became the nation my people had always longed for. Perhaps that is my true legacy. Not the throne I preserved, not the titles I guarded, but the bitterness I sowed. For in betrayal, I unwittingly gave the revolution something stronger than law, memory, and memory, once planted, cannot die. Ferdinand VIII of the Two Sicilies is a figure often remembered with a conflicted legacy. To his allies, he was the monarch who defended order and preserved his throne amid Europe's revolutionary storms. To his people, he was the king who swore before God and nation, only to turn his oath into a weapon against them. History rarely judges kindly such betrayals. The Revolution of 1820 did not survive, but it left an indelible mark. It showed that even in the south of Italy, long dismissed by northern statesmen as backward, bound to tradition, and unmoved by the liberal spirit, there burned a hunger for freedom. That flame was carried on by secret societies, whispered in exiled circles in Paris and London, and passed down through generations until it erupted again, fiercer each time. When Italians finally united under the tricolor decades later, they remembered the betrayals of kings like Ferdinand. The image of a monarch raising his hand in solemn promise, then bowing to Austrian bayonets, became a cautionary tale. It hardened the conviction that liberty could not be entrusted to crowns, that the future would belong only to those who seized it for themselves. And yet, there is a tragic irony. Ferdinand's repression, meant to suffocate the spirit of revolution, instead ensured that the idea of freedom could never truly die. The prisons became schools of resistance, the gallows became altars of sacrifice, and the silence he imposed became louder than any cry, echoing through time. We often think of history as shaped by great victories, wars won, crowns taken, treaties signed. But sometimes, it is the betrayals, the broken promises, the quiet acts of suppression that carve deepest into the memory of nations. Ferdinand's story is one such example. His throne did not survive long beyond his death, but the bitterness of his choices outlived him, feeding the dream of an Italy no king could smother. Today, when we look back at Ferdinand's reign, we are not only studying a monarch of the 19th century, we are confronting a timeless question. What does it mean to lead? Is it to preserve one's power at all costs, or to stand by the people even when the tide of history turns dangerous? Ferdinand chose the first path, and in doing so, he became both king and cautionary tale. For in the end, every crown is temporary, but memory endures.